This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, President-elect Joe Biden pledged Tuesday to distribute 100 million vaccine shots in the first 100 days of his administration. Biden's vow came on the same day Britain began a mass vaccination program using a vaccine developed by Pfizer-BioNTech. The vaccine's expected to be soon approved in the United States as well, as early as tomorrow. On Tuesday, President Trump held what he called a vaccine summit at the White House. Trump claimed COVID deaths and hospitalizations would quickly decrease, but the White House Coronavirus Task Force is warning the spread of COVID would not be reduced until the spring based on current vaccination plans. A report by the task force obtained by CNN states, quote, the current vaccine implementation will not substantially reduce viral spread, hospitalizations, or fatalities until the 100 million Americans with comorbidities can be fully immunized, which will take until the late spring, unquote. Meanwhile, a new report finds as many as 9 out of 10 people in dozens of poorer countries could miss out on the coronavirus vaccine until at least 2022 because wealthy countries, including the United States, have hoarded enough doses to vaccinate their entire populations nearly 3 times over. The report was issued by the People's Vaccine Alliance, which includes Amnesty International, Frontline AIDS, Global Justice Now, and Oxfam. This is Winifred Byanyima, Executive Director of UNAIDS, in a video produced by the People's Vaccine Alliance.
Huge pharmaceutical companies are keeping the vaccine research a secret. They're deciding how many vaccines get made, how much to charge for them, and who gets vaccinated. This will no doubt leave billions of people behind. Pharma companies are putting profit, not people, first. Yet, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money is funding their work. We cannot let the CEOs of a handful of pharmaceutical companies decide our future. We need a vaccine that everyone can have free of charge, no matter where you live or whether you're rich or you're poor. We need companies to share all their research so we can make enough safe vaccines for everyone. We need a vaccine owned by all of us. To end this COVID-19 pandemic, we need to pull together once more.
That was the UNAIDS Executive Director, part of the People's Vaccine Alliance. The World Health Organization has also warned about the inequitable distribution of the vaccine. This is WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
We simply cannot accept a world in which the poor and marginalized are trampled by the rich and powerful in the stampede for vaccines. This is a global crisis, and the solutions must be shared equitably as global public goods, not as private commodities that widen inequalities.
We're joined right now by 2 guests. In Oxford, England, Dr. Mohga Kamal-Yanni. She's policy advisor to the People's Vaccine Alliance and to UNAIDS, the joint UN program on HIV and AIDS. She's worked for decades on access to medicines and healthcare in developing countries. And in Bangalore, India, Achal Prabhala is with us, coordinator of the AccessIBSA project, which campaigns for access to medicines in India, Brazil, and South Africa. He recently co-authored an op-ed published in the New York Times headlined, "Want Vaccines Fast? Suspend Intellectual Property Rights." We're going to begin with the doctor, Dr. Mohga Kamal-Yanni. You're in Oxford, actually, where the one of those vaccine tests has began, and that is AstraZeneca, Oxford. But start off by talking about What is a people's vaccine, and what are the inequities right now? Who will get this vaccine, what countries, and what countries won't?
Well, the People's Vaccine is a coalition of organizations like Amnesty, Frontline AIDS, Global Justice, Oxfam. It's co-led by Oxfam and UNAIDS, and it has so many people, academics, health activists, health experts, NGOs, patient groups from all over the world, united for one aim, which has a people's vaccine, not a profit vaccine. So we want a vaccine. Basically, we're calling for vaccination that that is available for all people at risk, and then for everybody once we have enough doses, but not the way it's happening now, where if you happen to be born in a rich country, you get the vaccine. If you happen to be born in a poor country, you don't. And I mean, yesterday in the UK, they started vaccinating older people, and there was some clapping, and it was a lot of joy. And of course, that's brilliant, that there is hope that this problem that we're all suffering from will be, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. However, that joy is only limited to people living here. I've got friends and relatives and people that I work with in other countries, in developing countries, who are saying, yeah, and what about us? And yeah, what about them? So this is really a big problem. There's just so many. It's kind of dividing the world between those who have and can pay and those who don't and can't pay. And therefore, well, you can stand in the back of the queue. We don't know when you can get the vaccine. And that is just not right. It's not right on moral grounds. It's not right on public health grounds, because everybody's saying nobody's safe until everybody's safe. Yeah, okay. How do you make everybody safe? So a vaccine nationalism will not get you to everybody's safe. And also on economic ground, you're not going to get the economy growing if just one, or back to normal, if one country vaccinates its population and the rest of the world isn't. You can't trade with people who are sick, or people who have high level of infection. So it just doesn't make sense at all. The other important point is that this is not kind of fact of life that we have limited amount of vaccines. Actually, that's not the case. There are other options that will enable the world to produce more vaccines and therefore vaccinate more people. So basically what's happening now, if you can imagine that we have a small pie, so that's one vaccine, a small pie, and so basically the rich can have the bigger share of it, and then we'll have just crumbs left for developing countries. While the idea is why don't we increase the pie so everybody can have a decent share of it, rather than fighting on a little one?
Well, Dr. Kamal-Yanni, I wanted to ask you about the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine and how access to that vaccine may be more equitable at this stage. Could you talk about some of the agreements that the AstraZeneca has reached with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance?
Well, basically, I mean, this vaccine was being developed by Oxford University. Oxford University had a standard on managing intellectual property, and it actually talks about open license. However, when they did the deal or the contract with AstraZeneca, it became exclusive license for AstraZeneca. But they managed to put some conditions in the contract about making the vaccine accessible to developing countries. So AstraZeneca went to one of the big vaccine producers in India, the Serum Institute, and made an agreement to produce 1 billion doses. So that's vaccinating 500 million people. Half of them will be in India. So it's a good way, good start to make more vaccines available. AstraZeneca also has some agreements with other countries, like with Argentina and Brazil. So that may cover a number of people in Latin America. But what about the rest of the population? There's some other deals with countries, but not production as such. You can't leave, so AstraZeneca compared to others, yes, they've done good things, and also fixing the price as AstraZeneca said $4 per dose, and Serum said $3 per dose. So for developing countries, it will be probably $3 per dose, so 6 per course or per person. But the thing is, you can't leave, this is the whole thing, you can't leave the decision on supply, price, which country, which patient, to companies. That's not their job. Their job is to produce. And the job of governments is to make more production. So you have to enable other producers, like in India, there's other producers, other countries would have other producers. So if you allow technology transfer, so sharing technology, which the technology, by the way, a lot of it has been developed by public money, including from the US and the UK and Europe and other countries. So allowing the sharing of technology and removing the intellectual property barrier, so no patents on vaccines, then other companies can produce the vaccine, and we have more. And just like AstraZeneca did this contract with Serum that includes presumably technology transfer or some technology transfer, that can be done on a multilateral level, on a bigger level for more companies. Because all these deals, by the way, they're all secret. You don't know what's in it except what they announce. Rather than if you have a multilateral agreement, you don't, the negotiation happens in closed doors. But then once they agree a license, then it's public. Then you see what's good and what's bad about it.
And what about the whole issue that many developing countries are relying on the possibility of an effective vaccine coming from China? And China obviously is in last stage clinical trials for several vaccines. The potential for China being the one that supplies the bulk of the vaccines to the majority of the people of the planet, what that would mean in terms of international relations in the future?
Well, I mean, China has 4 vaccines in clinical trials, phase 3. Actually, the Emirate today announced that one of these vaccines passed clinical trials, and they authorized it to work in their country. They were convinced with the safety and efficacy of the clinical trials. So yes, if developing countries have nothing coming, they can't just sit. And I heard that from a number of countries. We're not going to sit and wait. So they are talking to companies in Europe and in America, but they're also talking to companies in China. And the King of Morocco said that he's going to vaccinate his people, and they're aiming at vaccinating 80% of the population. And again, they have an agreement with a Chinese company. That put the kind of the pressure on ensuring that these vaccines are, have high efficacy and high safety level, or at least acceptable safety level. And the thing is, we need that all clinical trials get published, whether that's from China or Pfizer or Moderna. It's no good that companies announce their results in a press release to investors, so they have more, their share value and their market value increase, but scientists who are waiting, who understand these things, cannot investigate or review the results because there's nothing published for them. So we need more of transparency on that, including the Chinese, so that countries are aware of what they're buying.
I wanted to bring Achal Prabhala into the conversation, again, coordinator of AccessIBSA project, which campaigns to access medicines for India, Brazil, South Africa. This piece you recently wrote in the New York Times, Want Vaccines Fast? Suspend Intellectual Property Rights. You're joining us from Bangalore, India. Can you talk about what that would mean if you suspended intellectual property rights? Talk about trade secrets, talk about patents, talk about government subsidies of these private companies, and how does what's happening now, the development of this vaccine, compare to people's access, for example, to the flu vaccine, how that was developed and financed?
Thank you, Amy. Firstly, it's great to be here, and thank you for having me. The piece that we wrote in the New York Times was geared around an event that's unfolding this week and the next. It doesn't look like it'll get resolved anytime soon or successfully, but that event is a proposal that South Africa and India made at the WTO, at the World Trade Organization, to temporarily suspend a trade rule called TRIPS, which is an agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property, the super governance of intellectual property worldwide, which the WTO takes on. And the reason India and South Africa suggested that all member countries of the WTO should be exempted from provisions of TRIPS is so that everything that we require to survive the pandemic, the masks, the test kits, but now especially the vaccines, should be free to be made in as much capacity as possible to get them faster and cheaper to as many people as we can around the world. There is an overwhelming support from developing countries for this proposal, but the WTO works on consensus, which means that even if 5 or 6 very rich countries oppose the proposal, it actually won't pass. And that's exactly what's happening. The US, the EU, the UK, and a few other rich countries, as well as inexplicably Brazil, have opposed this proposal and are stalling it, which means that it's unlikely to go through without a fight. Now, the irony of the fight having to take place this week is there's really good news out of the UK. There's also really good news out of science. And personally, for me, sitting in India, I wish I could share in that good news with the same spirit of cheer and celebration. I saw a moving interview with a 91-year-old called Martin Kenyon in London, who called his hospital, said, "Hey, I heard you had vaccines." They said, "Yes, come on over and get one." He walked over and he got a Pfizer vaccine, the first dose of a Pfizer vaccine, and he's looking forward to hugging his grandchildren this Christmas, and it's a beautiful, touching story. The problem with that is that Pfizer vaccine, over 90% of its supplies until the end of 2021, so that means for the next 13 months, have been sold out to a handful of rich countries, to the US, to the EU, and to the UK. There's actually no way that anyone in India or anyone anywhere outside these rich countries is going to get their hands on one of these vaccines for love or for money. They just don't exist outside a very few number of rich countries. That's kind of amazing to live through in 2020. I've been campaigning for access to medicines for a long time, but my father had COVID. He's 87 years old. My mother is 72 years old. I definitely would like them to have a vaccine and get one fairly quickly. The prospect of these vaccines being unrolled without any possibility of a majority of the world getting them is genuinely heartbreaking. And that's the anger that partly prompted that piece. The irony, of course, is that this is such a dramatically different situation from the 1950s when the flu vaccine was developed by Jonas Salk, who, of course, famously said, when asked by Ed Murrow about whether he was going to patent his invention, he said, can you patent the sun? And it's a heartbreak. It's a beautiful, it's a beautiful moment. It's a really beautiful moment. And
that was about the polio vaccine.
I'm sorry, that was about the polio vaccine. That's exactly right. And that's about the polio vaccine. The tradition of Jonas Salk, however, does continue with the flu vaccine that we all take. That flu vaccine is developed at a unit of the WHO, which is called informally the Flu Network and formally the Global Influenza Surveillance and Research Systems. It's a collaborative infrastructure that they've set up at the WHO that involves 110 different countries, 130 different laboratories, which pool information on what strains of influenza are circulating in their countries. That information is collated, and every year for 2 different flu seasons in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, the WHO then releases what would be called the formula for the flu vaccine, which then anyone, anywhere can produce because it's completely free of any proprietary intellectual property or monopoly. which means that billions of people have taken it since the 1970s based on this cooperative shared system of pooling knowledge as well as finances. And that's created a very robust infrastructure for the production and consumption of these flu vaccines. And it's a great success. It's unfortunately exactly the kind of thing that's not being replicated with the coronavirus vaccines.
Well, Achal Prabhala, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the refusal of these handful of rich countries to allow the suspension of intellectual property rights at the WTO, what is their argument, given the enormous worldwide crisis that we're functioning? How do they defend this, and what could possibly be done to overcome this resistance?
That's an excellent question. And look, I think in some way, I've been debating several people on this just this week after the New York Times piece came out, as well as previously because of my work. I wish actually sometimes that people would just be honest and upfront and say, look, we actually care about these corporations more than global human life. We're actually fine with a certain number of usually poor people dying for a lack of access to these vaccines, as long as the companies and the industry that makes them survives. I'd be willing to listen to that argument because it at least would be honest. What happens instead is that the arguments that are advanced are, A, that it's not a problem. To say that it's not a problem ignores 20 years of human history where millions of people died because of lack of access to monopoly drugs for AIDS, and then did so again for lack of access to drugs for cancer, and then did so again for lack of access to hepatitis C drugs. And by the way, are doing today in the United States for lack of access to insulin, which is again patented, for a lack of access to PrEP for AIDS, or for a lack of access to cystic fibrosis drugs in the UK. So it's to deny reality. But the logic that's advanced is that the innovation system requires these monopolies to exist in order to reward private pharmaceutical corporations for taking big risks with private money. Except for the fact that that's not what's happening here. It's never happened, but it's never happened as starkly as it is not happening in the pandemic. Moderna, which is just one of the vaccines that posted successful results a couple of weeks ago, has admitted by its own financial reports that 100% of its vaccine development project was funded by BARDA, by Warp Speed and the US government, US taxpayer money. On top of that, it's been given pre-orders of another $1.5 billion from the United States, and another substantial amount of money, nearing about $1 billion, from the European Union. Every other vaccine, from Pfizer to AstraZeneca, also has substantial government money. German taxpayer money of up to $445 million went into the Pfizer vaccine. AstraZeneca received huge subsidies through public money from the United Kingdom through its early development at Oxford University. All of these vaccines have, on top of that, received these very lucrative, very large pre-orders. Now, you can't have it always. You cannot have a vaccine project literally contracted out. I hesitate to say subsidy because when it's 100% of the cost, that's not a subsidy, that's ownership. You cannot have a prize like a pre-order of $6 billion, which is basically what Pfizer has awaiting it on successful completion of its trials and approval. And on top of that, say, but we also need the intellectual property monopoly because of all this private capital we've risked, which doesn't seem to actually exist. It is very, very strange, but this is the argument that's being advanced. It doesn't hold water. I think they understand that as well. It's just that this argument has a rich history. It's embedded in a particular kind of thinking, a particular branch of economics, which they know that they can ride on and, in effect, lie their way through opposing what is really a very sensible and unradical proposal made by South Africa and India at the WTO.
So finally, how exactly, summing up in a minute, if you got around trade secrets. If the companies were forced to release their trade secrets, they didn't get patents on this. How would a people's vaccine work? Every company all over could just develop the vaccine where it is. What's shocking, President Trump signed some executive order, not clear how enforceable it is, called America First. We have learned, if you're altruistic or not, if someone is sick somewhere in the world, you are in danger. So this is, everyone is in this together. But what would a people's vaccine, how would it happen?
What it requires is, firstly, for companies to say there are two aspects of our monopoly that we'll give up. We'll share with you our patents, and we'll share with you our trade secrets. Trade secrets are the know-how and the technology that's required to make a vaccine. It's a very important part of the process. If they were to say, look, we'll license this to any company with a reputation and a quality certification that's willing to make this vaccine with us, then let's open it up and let's have anyone interested do it. And if they did that, they would suddenly find that there are whole avenues of supply that open up around the world. There are over 20 vaccine manufacturers in India, but there are also 8 vaccine manufacturers on the continent of Africa. And there are a number of ways in which you can do this collaboratively. The one way not to do it is the way that they are, by producing these artificially limited quantities of these vaccines by sort of keeping it all to themselves.
And I wanted to ask Dr. Kamal-Yanni again about the situation with the Trump administration had removed the United States from the World Health Organization. President-elect Biden is now saying he will return the U.S. to the WHO. What do you think has been the impact of the United States pulling out of the WHO in the midst of this pandemic?
Well, I mean, what do you say about such an amazing, really, incredible, irresponsible, I'm afraid, decision in the middle of a pandemic to do that? I mean, it's strange decision, even if we're not in pandemic. So what do you think if we are in the middle of it? It's really, really not very good. My dream, to be honest, as a non-American about your election is to retain two things. One, the American role in advancing global health, and particularly in joining the WHO, and also putting science before politics. This has been also very, very problematic from the U.S. It really affected not just decision makers in other countries, but also ordinary people. This ignoring the science behind COVID was really, really bad. So we do hope that the new administration, I mean, they made commitment, Biden made a commitment to join the WHO. That is fantastic. The sooner, the better, that would be great. But also for the U.S. to join something like, or to voice public support for something like this technology access pool that WHO and other countries co-sponsored, to do the facilitation of licensing intellectual property, and so managing intellectual property, that your previous question, but also facilitating technology transfer to other companies. So supporting the CTAB would be absolutely fantastic. For the U.S. and new administration, I mean, it's not it wouldn't catch that December meeting that my colleague was talking about, but in general, playing a positive role in the WTO in putting public health before profit. And we're not saying companies don't make profit. We're not saying that at all. But we're saying that public health comes before profit, which is, by the way, something that all the World Trade Organization members agreed on in Doha in 2001.
Dr. Mohga Kamal, we want to thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Mohga Kamal-Yanni, People's Vaccine Alliance and UNAIDS. And thank you to Achal Prabhala, the AccessIBSA project, co-authored New York Times headlined piece that we will link to, Want Vaccines Fast? Suspend Intellectual Property Rights. He's speaking to us from Bangalore, and the doctor speaking to us from Oxford, England. When we come back, we look at why former jurors and even a prosecutor are speaking out against the federal execution of an African-American man, Brandon Bernard, scheduled to die Thursday. on International Human Rights Day. Stay with us.